Hello and most welcome to 952 of the Heidegger series, and I continue with this most fantastic Susie Vrobel or Frobel. I have now come to page 104 and see if I can get this photo any bigger. There are actually two lumberjackets here, and they must be from the US of A, possibly, or Canada, more fitting. Lumberjackets. I'm a lumberjacket, I'm all right. What is it about? Well, it's this couple oscillator. Actually, a saw is a couple oscillator. There are two people doing the sawing in olden times, and the very method of sawing, cutting down the wood, is a coupled oscillator. This is pointed out by Alva Noe. Perception is action. Whether or not the observer physically navigates through space, he interacts with the world, and that causes interference patterns. The same is true for temporal perception and cognition. Internal and external simultaneous rhythms cause temporal interference patterns, which may or may not lead to entrainment. Most of these rhythms are nested, since the length of simultaneous cycles usually vary. Nesting is always happening when the length is varying. It's a necessary part of different lengths in cycles. Nested simultaneous rhythms require more than one temporal dimension for their description, and are therefore temporal fractals. Succession delta t length does not suffice to describe a nested system. Embeddedness requires also simultaneity, which is delta t depth. And as the embedding rhythms often extend both into the past and the future, both causa efficient and causa finalis have to be taken into account when we deal with temporally nested system. To explicate a little bit here, think about the melody. In every note we listen to, I was listening to Mozart the other day. Eine kleine Nachtmusik. And for every note you're listening, so there is also an awareness of the past and the future. Otherwise there wouldn't be music. And that is both succession and simultaneity at the same time. Two absolute necessity for a deeper understanding of anything. We need simultaneity and succession. And therefore we have a causa efficiens and causa finalis. We always have a goal, that's the end of the melody, or alternatively the whole melody. And we have the causa efficiens, for what or with what. Those are the different notes. Both have to be taken into account when we deal with temporally nested system. We mentioned the case of the missing fundamental from music as an example of such a temporal fractal in chapter 3. In general, we may say that coupled and nested oscillators generate both delta t depth, simultaneity, and delta t length, succession. When dealing with coupled or nested rhythms, we should also consider a qualitative distinction which goes back to antiquity, the notion of chronos and kairos. And here is also a painting in the book of Susie Froebel, Saturn by Peter Paul Rubens from Antwerp, depicting Kronos eating his own child. According to Greek mythology, the figure of Kronos arose from primordial chaos and has henceforth personified clock time. Turning the zodiac wheel, he generates succession without assigning a special quality to any of the successive events. In chronological time, events are arranged in a linear way. Like beads on a string, Kairos, on the other hand, refers to the opportune moment in which future may be influenced. As the god of the fleeting moment, Kairos personified a favorable opportunity, whereas Kronos is quantitative in essence. The Kairos represent a bifurcation point which potentially give rise to a new quality. In the terminology of fractal time, Kronos can be described as mere succession on one temporal lod. The notion of Kairos, however, requires an additional temporal dimension, namely simultaneity in the form of nested lods. Both simultaneous and nested rhythms give rise to the Kairos. Self-organizing systems such as the populations of fireflies which flash in unison requires two lods. The level of individual agents and the level of collective behavior. The collective flashing is the emergent phenomena, that is to say, the new quality of large-scale attention-arousing signaling, which adds up to more than the sum of the blinking of the individual fireflies in their population. Simultaneous or nested lods are a necessary but not a sufficient reason for the Kairos. The Kairos also requires phase locking. This phase locking may occur on one level when coupled oscillators like fireflies entrain to each other's rhythms. It may also occur between two or more lods in the example of the overtones, where integer multiples of the fundamental frequency vertically locked into each other and formed a nested oscillator. Such nested simultaneous rhythms, which phase lock, can be described in terms of delta t depth and delta t length. Delta t length refers to the number of individual oscillators on one lod, and delta t depth to the number of embedding levels. Nested lods often exert both upward and downward causation. Not only do shorter embedded temporal structures influence or bring about longer embedding ones, but also vice versa. Longer rhythms influence shorter embedded ones, such as the slow oscillation described by Bujaki, which modulate faster local events. The dynamics of both the observer and his context run together in the Kairos. From an internal perspective, it becomes next to impossible to distinguish between a now, capital N, within which we can usually interact with embedding lods, and the phenomenon Jung calls synchronicity, the temporally coincident occurrence of acausal events. In nested systems, upward and downward causation can be interpreted as inside-outside causation. That is to say, the inner nestings, the shorter cycle, which I have within me, have a causal impact on their outer ones, the longer embedding cycles and vice versa. This is not true for strange loops because circular causality is limited to a small number of LODs. The decisive upward causation, which would disentangle the strange loop, is blocked by the inviolate level. Causality at work in the temporal dimension of delta T depth describes a causal relationship which is referred to as a coincidence of acausal events, if the LODs involved cannot be identified. If, as Van Nieuwenhuizen claims, all communication is internal on the respective LOD, it is tempting to look at what happens when we choose a context which contains all frequencies at equal distribution. In other words, a context which can mirror all internal dialogue. This context is white noise, a random signal. Remember the signal coming from the inner ear, the cochlear device. That is to say, uncorrelated in time, which contains all frequencies at an equal distribution. Remember here now, we are stepping away from, what can we call that? Randomness. Because fractality sort of puts randomness aside. Is the level of complexity, not if the complexity is random, constructed by me, of my desires, my emotion. It is the level of complexity, of intricacy, which play together with the outer environment, both in spatial, temporal, and knowing basis. And once more, we are very close to the region of Edvard de Bono, who very squarely puts into question the idea of what we usually call random to be something always bad. It is the part of the readout. It's not the only part, and in a way, when the telos erupts, it doesn't matter if it was random from the start, because the telos will tell afterhand why we gather it. I think this is most interesting. So it's a turnover in some ways. We get a telos, so what we achieve is no longer random, but the reality in some ways is actually random. Let's talk about a deconstruction. This is why Susie Froebel is so impressive. So we usually, epistemologically, sociologically, anthropologically, it is very important in an article, in an essay, in a book, to claim the authority of the individual things. Here is suggested the individual things could well be random, mythological, unreal. It is the telos that tells us whether they serve their purpose or not. The causa efficiens and the causa causa finalis. I think this is interesting. This is another take on sequencing. We can think of sequences have becoming too stable. We cannot change the sequencing. We think sequencing somehow is part of a stable outer world. And the suggestion seemed to be, this is my take on it, a suggestion from Susie Frobel is that we need to see causa finalis and causa efficiens as things that could be fixed after a hand, so to speak. And they could also be in this much despised saying of the Jesuits, it is the goal that explains the means. Something usually frowned upon in academia, but there is a special lockdown. And I have mentioned this before, this lockdown is massive. Edward de Bono showed that 95% of all academia think for some reason you can reach the new thing with the old by using logic, rationality and propositional reasoning. That we know is completely impossible. That wouldn't surprise me that the academic, I think there is a special pre-made order in the world. Like there is a first coming from reality and a second coming from reality. And although I'm laughing, I have myself been subject to such misconceptions. We really need this understanding of fractality to have another way to go about. Otherwise, we actually have to make do with that there is a universal order ingrained into the world. Just like James Locke and Immanuel Kant. I would say my laughter here was a lot of relief as well, because this is simply relaxing. And I mean this in the most positive sense. A relaxing of the intellectual skill. And this relaxation is very important to get the thrust. If there is no rest of the mind, and I would say in the idea of there being an absolute pre-made sequence to everything, there can be no rest. This is a rhythm that is not playing with the music. This is a violin in the string quartet that playing against the tune and in an automatic fashion. Not intentionally playing against the melody, but playing in a non-skilled automatic fashion. Unaware is the word. Playing in a way that's unaware. And unawareness takes a toll on the causa efficiens and the causa finalis. Let's continue here. Sorry for my digression, but it's so interesting. This context is white noise. A random signal, that is to say uncorrelated in time, which contains all frequencies at equal distribution. It is an ideal construction, of course, as real noise cannot have infinite bandwidth. However, one can produce white noise for a limited frequency band, which displays almost the same characteristics. White noise is a temporal fractal. It is statistically self-similar in the sense that its deviations remain the same under time dilation or contraction. So what does white noise do as context? When we stand close to boiling kettle or a cooker hood, devices whose bandwidth more or less resembles that of white noise, we may suddenly hear the phone ringing, the doorbell, our mother's voice, or any other familiar sound. The external signal which reaches us is extremely rich. Ideal white noise contains all frequencies at an equal rate, so it's conceivable that it triggers whatever response we expect. Well, the take on that is when we get this noise from the cattle, we will be able to more clearly hear other sounds, like our mother's voice or somebody ringing the doorbell. Therefore, we leave the kettle. When we come back, we notice it has boiled. This phenomenon was exploited in the Ganzfeld experiments. Whose name derives from a German term meaning entire field. The idea was to filter out all external signals, whether visual, auditory or haptic, in order to test individuals for extrasensory perception, an early version of isolation tanks. By filtering out environmental impact, sensory deprivation was simulated, and it was hoped that the test subjects would then hear internally generated impressions. Most results were inconclusive. However, the experiment is of interest in the context of our topic of embedded observer participants, because it produces the most fertile context imaginable. Anything can be extracted from or projected onto white noise. There are colors of noise. By filtering white noise, we can produce pink noise, also known as 1 through F noise. Another temporal fractal which manifests itself as correlations between fluctuations on a nested timescale. It is present, for instance, in many musical tunes, heartbeat rhythms, meteorological, seismological and financial data. But although it seems to be ubiquitous in nature, the physical origin for pink noise is not known. This makes pink noise a suspicious context. A pattern we observed everywhere may well be self-generated, possibly the result of a superimposed interfacial structure. Depending on where we set the interfacial cut, pink noise can be assigned to the external system under observation, the measuring chain, the observer himself, or any combination of these. One contributor is our brain. As Bujacki has shown, the brain generates a large family of oscillations whose spatiotemporal integrations give rise to 1 through F statistics, pink noise. The neural 1 through FA noise hints at both most complex dynamics but also high instability. As Bach et al. Have pointed out, 1 through F systems self-organize without external tuning and undergo phase transition. This is all news to me, I have to say. A behavior they coined self-organized criticality, SOC. However, in the brain, SOC, which for instance in the shape of neural avalanches may cause epileptic seizure, is usually prevented by stabilizing oscillatory dynamics. Also, phase locking between neighboring cortical oscillators is prevented by the fact that the ratios between their mean frequencies are not integers, so adjacent bands cannot linearly phase lock. As seen earlier in this chapter, phase locking of some oscillators within our bodies, e.g. heartbeats, heart cells, is vital, whereas others would be disastrous, e.g. synchronous activity of neurons which manifests themselves as epileptic seizures. This is also true for inside-outside face locking, that is to say, entrainment between observer and context. Apart from entrainment into rhythms such as the spin of the earth, we also entrain to others' individuals' mental state by simulating, e.g. a crouch posture and the willingness to give up easily on a task, or bouncing gait and a happy mood. We see here how the movement we do affects our understanding. Not only the level of understanding, but what we understand. And white noise, pink noise, gray noise, that influences what colors we see, or rather the degree of colors. The degree is somewhere on the scale of 1 to 24. The lowest scale is the most common in Western society. We see the lowest amount of color, and we get the least sensory satisfaction out of that. That goes hand in hand. Apart from entrainment into rhythms such as the spin of earth, we also entrain to others' individuals' mental states by simulating both the physical side we observe and the corresponding mental side. This simulation is carried out by mirror neurons, nerve cells which fire when we simulate another individual's behavior and mental state. Mirror neurons were detected by Giacomo Rizzolatti in the early 1990s and are now studied also in the context of education, since learning by imitation can now be explained in a new light. Recent research has shown that we are capable of resisting such contextualization by mirroring. Cheng et al.'s results show that individuals can resist contextualization, for instance, in the case of doctors on learning to empathize with a patient's plights. Self-protective mechanism of this kind would allow such a doctor to act out a role without inflicting damage on himself. However, if taken too far, such desensitizing can have horrific consequences. For instance, when it produces individuals who are capable of torturing others. The reality which we generate and discern is the reality of contextualization. Therefore, an ethics of constructivism must place the right to resist contextualization at the center of discussion. Contextualization can be measured in terms of our degree of involvement. We can widen our perspective by contextualizing or narrow by resisting contextualization. If our ability to contextualize is compromised, we cannot generate simultaneity, like the non-fractal observer described in Chapter 2. The now is the culmination point of successful and unsuccessful contextualizations, a temporally extended window in which time and duration emerge as the result of simultaneous contrast. Simultaneity is generated by successful handshake, meaning that an interaction takes place. Succession is generated by unsuccessful attempt to interact. However, success here should not simply be equated with passivity. In parenthesis, given our terminology, epileptic seizures will be classed as internal successive handshakes. I have addressed both cognitive and physical intromissions and extromission in a phenomenological framework. exemplified by nested oscillators, mindfulness and embodiment. The notion of embodiment in particular requires a communication model which takes account of both cognitive and physical intromission and extramission. A promising candidate is Jerry Chandler's model, which includes novel concepts such as exformation. In a nutshell, the idea is that real flesh and blood human beings exchange emissions which undergo a number of transformations on the way from person A to person B, because multiple message sources have to be integrated. What we perceive are sensory impressions, which first have a physical impact on us, say, air pressure waves we perceive via our auditory perceptual apparatus and our epidermis. Next, these impacts are transformed into information by our bodies. We then abstract from this information what is meaningful to us in terms of symbol system at our disposal. Our reaction to these incoming impressions and the transformation they undergo is that we conclude that we have understood something and wish to respond. In order to do so, we infer from the outcome of our internal translation and restart the procedure. This time is in reverse. We extract what we regard as relevant from available symbol systems and formulate a response which is expressed via our sensory motor system as sound waves. We produce and/or gesture and mimics. Given the many transformations along the line, a lot of communicative process will remain opaque to the parties involved. Another interesting feature of the interaction of intromission and extramission is the extended boundary resulting from the interference pattern of inside and outside, which manifests itself as potential space. That is, if we include cognitive extramissions in the shape of intentions and goal-directed behavior. Development psychologist D.W. Winnicott defines this extension, the potential space, as a realm which belongs neither to the observer nor to the rest of the world. It is a sphere of influence which partakes in both. Potential space is both created and inhabited by what Winnicott refers to as transitional objects. He describes these as the first non-I, for instance, a teddy bear, a security blanket, like that carried around by the cartoon character Linus, or a lullaby which an infant may hum. Their function is to familiarize oneself with the unknown by mediating between inside and outside, self and non-self. Transitional objects, the objects used, and phenomena, the techniques employed, function as a special kind of context. They do not belong only or the inside or the outside. I think that should be they do not belong only to the inside or the outside, but partake in both. Not unlike internal and external interacting rhythms. Together they form interfaces, that is to say, interactive filters with the world, and thus govern how we link inside and outside. The potential space both joins and separates me, me extensions, and the non-me. Play and culture experience as well as science and religion belong to this realm between subject and object, between inside and outside. So you see here the importance of non-self, the negative space. That is what is the white noise or the pink noise. The interactiveness that makes it possible for the I to come, sort of say, into reading. Without a non-self there cannot be a self. And I think this is something that goes all through the writing of Susie Frobo, but also deconstruction. The necessity to have the non-thing, the thing that usually is the absence of Western metaphysical ideas or ontologic claims, turn out to be incredibly important to have something. To have a now, it's dependent on the absence. To have an I is dependent on the non-I, and so forth. And they seem to inhabit a space in between the self and the non-self, in between the subject and the object. Transitional objects, the objects used, and the phenomena, the techniques employed, function as a special kind of context. They do not belong only to the inside, they partake in both. Together they form interfaces, that is to say, interactive filters with the world, thus govern how we link inside and outside. The potential space both joins and separates me, me extensions and non-me, play and culture experience as well as science and religion. And this is the realm that is between subject and object. As a development psychologist, Winnicott is concerned with the acquisition of transitional objects and potential spaces in early infancy. The mother adapting to the infant's needs plans and reinforces the illusion of magical control over the world. It is only when the child gradually realizes that it is not in control that its first concepts of an external reality emerges, and it is the transitional object which form the first interface with the rest of the world. Although people around the child will recognize the objects as being a teddy bear or blanket, they are aware at the same time that it is far more than this. The meaning that the infant attributes to its first possessions makes it the first object it has created, a link to an external reality. Adults create potential spaces too. Their transitional objects can be found in culture, art, religion and science. But also objects like teddies or dolls are often readopted late in life to compensate for a loss or an unfulfilled need. Some transitional objects stay with us for many years, some for a lifetime. More often, however, they tend to be an ephemeral nature and become obsolete, ending up as mere favorite objects. Their original meaning and function have been incorporated in the owner once the object is no longer needed. Through a boundary shift towards the inside, it has become assimilated context. I think that makes perfect sense. So we may contextualize by weaving together inside and outside with potential space. The resulting interference pattern, which forms our boundary, our interface reality, has an extended structure which hosts transitional objects and phenomena. A similar boundary shift occurs when we experience a change in our proprioception. Glaser has given the term transcensus to the ability to extend our self-perception to other living beings or objects by integrating them into our own proprioception. The process of incorporating others or melting into an object forms transcending boundaries. When we ski down a piste, for instance, we feel the consistency. Oh, Sigdome, Sigmone. We feel the consistency of the snow as being powder-like or icy through the way our skis sink into the snow or the amount of friction created. Our proprioception has changes in such a way that skier and skis have become one systemic whole through which the world is perceived. Transcensus also emerges when we imagine that part or all of another person's or an animal's body belongs to our own. For example, if a physician's hand is resting on our skin and we think of that hand as being part of ourselves, then our physical state can measurably improve. Better circulation, deeper breathing, and an increase in the elasticity of our tissues. Closely connected to this skill of transcensus is the ability to trust. Kestenberg described a trusting baby belly as an example of this attitude of trust, which triggers deep and smooth respiration. Each person is another person's context, but it's largely up to us whether we allow parts of ourselves to be assimilated, as was the case in the borderline patient in chapter 4, or decide to integrate part of our environment or other human beings into our proprioception. Transcensus can be hell, it forces us into rigid context. L'enfer, c'est les autres. Or limited by inflexible frameworks, trapped by category. On the other hand, it can be heaven if the incorporation of another person into a proprioception allows us to experience love and beauty. Homo homini contextus. Once more, a really great chapter from Susie Froebel, and there is a blinding 18 left. How will I cope with all this joy? Well, I say thank you very much, and I bid you a very pleasant afternoon.